topic that I'd like to introduce you guys to is something called debugging. You may have heard of debugging in various forms before, and maybe you're even doing some sort of rudimentary debugging now. But basically what it boils down to is an elegant way to be able to step-by-step go through your program and figure out why it's crashing. So, generally you have three main ways to go about analyzing if a program is crashing or if it's not working properly. One would be to just look through the code and see if you can figure it out line by line. Another one is something that a lot of you may have been doing, which is just throwing in a bunch of couts, which works just fine, but it can get, as you've probably seen, very tedious in terms of trying to put them in and also remembering to take them out afterwards, and it doesn't really give you that much information. The third, and what I would say is the best way to go about doing it, is using a debugger or a debugging tool. And that's what I'm going to introduce you guys to today. So I think the best way to teach that is just to go straight into an example. So what I've done here is I've created a tiny little project. It has a main and it has a getInt array. And all this does, the getInt array, is it takes in a number called numints and it returns a pointer to an array of integers. So in here, it'll create a new array of integers, numints of them, and it'll return this new array. In main, all we do is we create something called an int array. We get an int array from that function. We do something silly with it, just setting a default value to 0. And then presumably you'd use it in some sort of smart way during main. And then at the end, of course, we're going to clean up our memory. We're going to delete it. So if I go ahead and run this, we see it stopped working or it's crashed. Many of you have probably come across this in your labs or in other assignments, and really 99% of the time what this boils down to is you're using a pointer incorrectly. So with using pointers incorrectly, it can be a whole slew of explanations as to how or why you're doing that. And again, you can kind of just look through the code or you can do couts along the way, but what I'm going to show you is how to zero in on that problem with a debugger. So the first thing you'll need to do with Dev C++, and this will change a little bit version to version, is you need to enable the debugger. And what this will do is when you click compile, it'll insert all the information that the computer needs in order to allow us to stop at certain points. You'll see in a second. So if you click on Tools and you go to Compiler Options, what you're going to do is you're going to, if they're not clicked already, you're going to click both of these text boxes and you're going to put in -G. And that's just telling the compiler to generate debug information. Great. So the biggest thing, the number one way to use a debugger is through what are called breakpoints. In Dev C++, the way that you do that is by clicking on the line number. For example, if I want a breakpoint at this line, I click here. And what that does is it says, okay, when this program is run, stop just before you've run or you've executed this line of code. And then what we'll see is that you'll be able to manually yourself go through line by line and be able to analyze variables and look at the state of the program. So we're going to compile this, and then instead of running, we're going to click on debug here. The shortcut is F5 in Orwell, and you can also just click on this. There are a million different ways. You can click on this check mark if you like. So click on the check mark, we see it's running, and then the lines turn blue. Basically, it has stopped here. It is not yet called getInt array. So again, remember, this is a little bit of a silly example, but the key here is our program is crashing and we want to figure out why. There are once you've stopped at a breakpoint, there are two main ways to progress, or I guess three main ways to progress through the program. One is using next line, where if I click next line, it'll execute this line and go to the next one. So I'll show you guys here. If I click next line, it's called getInt array. It has executed all the code in here because it was all within this top line. And then now we've stopped and we have not yet assigned values to this. going to go ahead and stop execution, run debug again. Another way that you can go forward is by clicking continue. This is just to keep going as if there was no breakpoint. And one way to go line by line or into a line is through its into function. So if I click on into function, it's going to go into the function that we are about to call. So let's go ahead and click that. So we're in this function now, get int array. You can see highlighted in blue. So we can do several things. One is we can keep going if we like, or we can look at the variable values, either by hovering over it. You can see numint is equal to 0, which makes sense. We passed in 0 over here. Or we can right-click on it and click an add watch. So that means watch this variable, watch the value, and tell me the value over on this left-hand pane as it changes. So I'm going to go ahead and click next line. So we see that numint is 0, so it's going to be returning null. Okay, so next line should jump out, right? It's now returning out of this function, and we're here. So let's just make sure that int array is null. If I hover over it, we can see it's 0x0. I'll add a watch here. 0x0, what that means is null. So now we can figure out exactly what's happening. Aha! Int array is null, but we're trying to access the element at 0. Obviously, that is going to throw a null pointer exception. In this case, it'll call it a sig_sevv, segmentation fault. Don't worry too much about this memory map here. If you get into higher kind of fourth-year courses or third-year courses on compilers, you'll start recognizing what this is, but for you, it doesn't matter. Let's stop execution. So we can go any number of ways. Really, it's an art. It's not a science. If you figured it out from here, you can just fix the problem, or you can just keep going and debugging and trying more and more to get into the nitty-gritty. But in this case here, we can see that it returned null when we didn't want it to, and we say, aha, we passed in 0. So if instead we passed in something like 3, we can go ahead, run that, and it's not a very fancy program. Nothing really happens, but it does not crash anymore. So that's a really simple example of using a debugger. What I'm going to do is show you kind of a more realistic example as in your labs. So here I've created a few quick and small classes. There's a car class, much like on your midterm. And the car class, it has two methods. It has setOwner, where you set the name. You're given a name, it'll set the owner of the car. And then you can drive a certain number of kilometers. And in terms of its member variables, it has a pointer to an owner, and it keeps track of the number of kilometers that are on the car. If we jump into the owner class, now we're in the owner class, you instantiate an owner with a name. So that could be me. Owner is Rob of a Honda Civic. You can get the name, nothing fancy here, and the owner class will store the name. And then we have a dinky little main function here. So we instantiate a car, and you have to think, what scope is this car in? Well, we're not creating it with new, so it's not being allocated on the heap, it's being allocated on the stack, i.e. the scope of the function main. So once we hit here, it's out of scope and it will be destructed. And then in this dinky little main, we're going to drive 792 kilometers to New York City, and then we're going to see out an I Heart New York. And I did this on purpose. We'll see why in a few minutes. So if I go ahead and run this crashes as well. We see I Heart New York, but it crashes. So this is similar to what I've seen some of you guys experience. So it seems a bit odd, right? We create a car, we drive, see out I Heart New York. It should end, right? But obviously it's not. It's crashing. So we're going to use the debugger to go and see exactly what's happening here. So you can start wherever it makes sense to you. Let's go ahead and just start at the very beginning, and let's debug. So we're at this line here. If I click into function, it's going to go into the constructor because we are constructing the car here. It's kind of an implicit call because we're not full out saying car constructor, but it is happening. So let's just see what happens. Into function, here we are in the car constructor. We're going to be setting kilometers. Let's get rid of these guys. Clear all. So we're going to add a watch on kilometers and on owner. So kilometers we're going to set to a default value of 0. Next line. So there it is at 0. And then owner we're going to set to null. So there owner is null. Perfect. Next line comes back into the main. mycar.drive. Let's go ahead. Let's just step into the function, even though we know that's not where it crashes. Inside of drive, we're given kilometers, right? We can highlight that. We can see it's 792. And we're going to be setting the instance variable or the member variable. We're going to be adding that number of kilometers. So keep track of it up here. I'm going to click next line. I guess it'll have to update the next time we go into, because right now we're outside of the class. So that's fine. I Heart New York. It's going to see out. I'm going to click next line. So that seems weird, right? It does a segmentation fault at I Heart New York, but we're not really calling anything. Can you think of what's happening? Well, what did we say car was in the scope of? We said it was in the scope of main. So really, just after cout, it's going to be destructed. And this, again, is an implicit call that might throw some of you guys off with respect to your programs crashing. So let's hit debug one last time. I'm at cout, and this is what you guys should do. Even though we're not calling a function here, I'm going to click into function. And that is going to get us into the car destructor. Into function, here we are in the destructor. Next line. String name equals owner get name. So what's owner? It's null. And we're going to see this, if I click next line, is where it breaks. So let's close this for a sec. Owner was null, right? So what happens if we call get name on a null object? It doesn't know how to dereference. It has nothing to dereference. So now we say, aha. We went into car, we called drive, but we never actually set an owner. So this here would have been an erroneous call. And that's kind of a little primer into how to use debuggers. You can use them by looking at which tests fail or what tests crash your program and setting a breakpoint there. Remember to go into tools, compiler options, and add these -G's. Otherwise, it won't stop where you want it to stop. And really, this is an introduction into what's a huge field and an extremely helpful tool in software that I'm sure you guys will get more and more experience into, and it's something that is absolutely fantastic to be able to put on your resume.